that were new to me. Our founding mothers really were amazing. At the time of the Revolution, women were mainly limited to the domestic sphere. Despite growing cities, most women lived on farms and produced everything they used. As towns grew, specializing began, such as making soap, butter, or cheese, and trading it for possibly woven goods, bartering with each other in an off-the-books economy run by women. Most women who married founders were from wealthier families and knew how to read and write, even though they might not have had formal education. Women had almost no legal rights. A system called coverture gave a husband major powers over their wives, essentially owning them. Wives did have very few rights over property they brought into a marriage, such as a dowry. Women were constantly pregnant, often having a baby about every 2 years. Women who lived, although many died in childbirth, wound up with 5 to 7 live children from 5 to 10 pregnancies, which must have been very devastating. Men handled the politics, and women handled pretty much everything else. Most had household help. Even many in the North owned slaves, and the help may have been from a family member or an indentured servant as well. Somewhat surprising that New York State had the highest number of enslaved people, 10% of the population in the North. 40% of New York City households owned slaves. We never think about that. And the second largest slave market in the country was in New York City. I'd like to begin this afternoon's conversation with some of the wives of our founding fathers, even though I'm sure you've heard of many of them. We're starting. George Washington met and married Martha Dandridge Custis when she was a wealthy widow with 2 small children, and he was a very good-looking, debt-ridden hero of the French and Indian Wars. He expected to enjoy life at Mount Vernon and managing Martha's wealth. They had almost 15 years before he took command of the army. She was threatened with kidnapping by the loyal governor of Virginia, and she succumbed to her husband's pleas to join him at the Army's camp in Cambridge, Massachusetts, during the British occupation of nearby Boston. And she was to join him at his winter headquarters throughout the war, raising morale, providing shirts and socks for the fighting men, and shortening their forced separations over the next 8 years. She met 2 wives of fellow generals, Lucy Knox and Catherine Kitty Green, who became her lifelong friends. They also joined their husbands in camp, leaving their children with friends or family who often had to move households to avoid capture by the enemy. It's one thing that I didn't really think about until I started doing this about. The revolution was really in their backyards and their front yards and all over. And there were so many threats, and to talk about, say, Kitty Green left her kids here, and then they had to move there, and then they had to move there. And as a mom, I'm trying to think, like, what is that like to leave your children? Ironically, they spent the winter in camp with their husbands, and then the next summer they had babies, and then they left the kids and went back to camp. I really can't quite imagine that whole thing, but anyway.
Do you want me to switch slides? Watch slides?
Yes, so that's Martha, younger and older. This is Lucy Knox. Her husband was an important general during the war. And there's Catherine Kitty Green. There's a talk in several sources that I think it was when they were at Monmouth for the winter. She danced for 3 hours straight with George Washington.
Wow.
All 3 of these women were among the many family members of soldiers who were constantly in danger of capture. And all 3 couples became fast friends of Mercy Otis and James Warren and Abigail and John Adams. We'll hear more about those women later. Martha also brought shirts and other supplies made by her slaves at Mount Vernon during the summer campaigns. At Valley Forge, she set up a sewing circle of officers' wives, was busy this is a quote, from early morning to late at night, providing comfort for sick soldiers. And these women and many others continue to provide support and boost morale each winter. General Washington deplored the wives and children who followed the armies because they were either too destitute to survive at home or too stubborn to stay there. But they gave the army an unprofessional appearance. Nevertheless, he welcomed his wife at every winter camp, including the one at New Windsor, not far from here, and found many contributions of these women most useful. Abigail. Abigail Adams was one of the earliest American women to advocate for women's rights. Her most famous quote is from a letter to husband John to remember the ladies sent when he was working on the Constitution. She added, "Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men, sorry, gentlemen, all men would be tyrants if they could." He wasn't very compliant. They did write constantly to each other during their many, many long separations, addressing each letter to dearest friend, and many letters survived for both of them and have been published, and so that we really can help to better understand the trials of both separation and war. Left alone to raise their 5 surviving children and manage their small farm for months, even years, as her husband served at home and abroad, she began to speculate and invest to improve their financial standing. And she was very good at it. She had to be covert, though, as married women had no standing, so worked through a third party. She was a strong supporter of separating from England from the beginning, constantly urging this in her letters to John. Forward-thinking, with a mind of her own, and not afraid to express her opinions, she had a strong influence on the men in charge, particularly her husband. After the war, she served with John when he was ambassador to England, vice president, and president. They were the first family to live in the White House. I think it was the second or third year of his presidency that they moved the capital to Washington. She was always her husband's closest confidant and advisor, and continued to be opposed to slavery and a strong advocate for women's education. After her husband was elected president, he wrote, "I have never wanted your advice and assistance more in my life." And even though she did not live to see it, their son, remember John Quincy Adams, who spent many years traveling with his father when he was young, was our 6th president. Deborah Franklin first met Benjamin when she was 15, and he was a runaway from his apprenticeship to his brother's print shop in Boston. He was from a very large family, I think something like more than 12 children. Ooh. They became engaged, and the governor of Pennsylvania sent him to England to buy a printing press. Her mother was not in favor of Ben and married her to another man who squandered her dowry and absconded to the West Indies, where he reportedly died. Thus, when Ben returned more than 2 years later, after having a wonderful time in England, he returned without the press, they began a common law marriage which lasted the rest of her life. Deborah worked in the print shop and her mother's sundry shop. She kept the books, helped invest in real estate, and their print shops spread out along the Atlantic coast and back even to the frontier. It probably never occurred to her that she was doing double duty. Business was so successful that Ben was able to retire at 42 to devote himself to his scientific experiments and public affairs. And his long absences began again, leaving Deborah to deal with everything and everybody at home, including the postal system that was really just beginning, and Ben was responsible for it. 1758, she even stood up to Lord London for her workers and their duties. Pretty unusual for that time. 5 years later, Ben went back to England, he came home and went on a tour of the Postal Service because he was still supposed to be taking care of that. She refused to go with him, so he took their daughter Sally, who was, he had an illegitimate son when they got married. Nobody ever knows where William came from. And then they had one son, I think he was Ben Jr., and I didn't find too much about him. But their daughter Sally appears a lot in the history books that I was reading. Ben ran for the Pennsylvania Assembly. He lost, so he decided to build a new house in Philadelphia, and then he went again to London. Although she missed him and enjoyed his very infrequent letters, 10 years later, Deborah died. Ben finally had to return home to tend to all the business affairs his wife had managed so well for so long. And he was kind of annoyed about it. I have to leave, because he was always having, you probably know, he was quite the reprobate. As resistance to British rule heated up, spurred by the hated taxes, women led boycotts of British goods. They literally wore their views, spurning silks and satins for homespun, even for celebrations. They spun from 6 to 6 at one meet organized by the Daughters of Liberty while discussing politics. They were actually encouraged to leave their domestic sphere, but creation of cloth was extremely time-consuming and added yet one more chore to their already very long lists. Women's place was changing. Women joined in mobs and political demonstrations and continued their subversive activities in parsonage and parlors. And Continental Congress was convened, all male, of course. Writers and printers became very important for spreading ideas, increasing support, and informing the public. Providing news of the war was critical. Phyllis Wheatley was purchased as a slave when she was 7 or 8 years old, fresh from Africa, by an elite Boston family. She was named Phyllis after the ship she arrived on, and the family learned that she was extremely intelligent and allowed her time off for studying English, Christianity, and even Latin and ancient history. Writing poetry was her greatest talent. She became a celebrity in Boston after a poem was published in a Massachusetts newspaper, and even more famous on both sides of the Atlantic after she had a book of poetry published in England. When Washington arrived in Cambridge, right outside Boston, occupied by the British, she wrote and published a poem about him, which ended with this rousing cry: "Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington, be thine." Washington sent her a letter and invited her to visit at his headquarters, where he was often entertaining, including Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren as guests. Phyllis was granted her freedom shortly after the publication of her book. The Wheatleys died, and she married a free black grocer named John Peters. They were poor, and she died in childbirth, age 31, in 1784. Mercy Otis Warren, another woman who's more famous than some of mine in this talk, was a very close friend of Abigail Adams, and they wrote back and forth constantly. Her plays, poems, and personal letters supported the cause of liberty, as did Abigail. As Mercy's words were often published, sometimes by herself, her patriotic works survive. She was sister and wife to avid sons of liberty. She was allowed to share in education with her brothers, and her father, husband, and brother all supported her later work. In spite of having 5 boys in 9 years, her political writings were extremely prolific as well as popular. Plays were outlawed in Puritan Boston, and she's not wearing homespun in this picture. Thus, her ode to the Boston Tea Party was disguised as a myth. She was not a true revolutionary, as she also championed women's arts. She didn't want to alienate the men, so she proposed that women could do both, raise children and produce writing with a sensible use of time. Remember, she had household help. Mary Catherine Goddard was left to run her family's printing business when her brother was off fighting. She proved to be very good at her job and successful, while many others were not. It was a hard time to keep things going with a war going all around you. Her name was even on the masthead of the Maryland Journal, most unusual for a woman. The Continental Congress hired her to print copies of the Declaration of Independence. Notice the time lag, January 1777. So almost 6 months after it was signed. For the first time, the names of all the signers would be made public. This was a big deal, as the signers were considered by George III to be traitors, punishable by death. And Mary Catherine used her full name rather than her usual M.K. Goddard, which was probably her way of disguising her sex with her writing. And many women did that, many women writers did that back in the day, which was perhaps an act. Publishing this thing could have gotten her hung, but fortunately it did not. Women on, all right, so now we're going to go on from the printers to the spies. Women on both sides of the conflict made very good spies. In fact, they were excellent. They were rarely suspected, probably because men underestimated their capabilities, and the British often quartered themselves, especially officers, in American homes and had planning meetings there. And they weren't that careful about their talk. Lydia Dara was a Quaker. They were generally opposed to war, the Quakers, and rarely took up arms, but many did side with and help the Patriots. Her heroism occurred during the British occupation of Philadelphia in 1777 to 78. And the sketch over on the right-hand side of the screen kind of shows what she might have done. This was during the British occupation of Philadelphia. Soldiers were quartered in her home and were not too cautious about their conversations being overheard as she came in to bring wood or maybe even refreshments. That December, Lydia overheard the British, who were meeting in her parlor, discussing their plans. She obtained a pass from the British to go to the country near Valley Forge, where the army was, to buy flour for bread. The message detailing General Howe's plans for an attack was passed to an American soldier who took it to Washington. Americans were prepared and the attack was averted. She also regularly recorded other information in special shorthand, known only by the Dara family, hid the message under her son's coat buttons, who took the messages to his brother, who was serving in the Continental Army. I was amazed at the creativity and the sneakiness that these people, figured out to get the job done. Agent 355 is a mystery lady who was a member of the Culper spy ring operating in and around New York City. By the end of 1777, it was well established and run by two men named Talmadge and Townsend. Those are not their real names. Messages were encoded by a system of numbers assigned to 763 commonly used words, places, and people. They were then written, the messages, in invisible ink and covered with another regular letter. Transcribing these things must have been quite the trick. These were then passed through several others across the Sound and eventually reached Washington. Agent 355 was discreetly referred to as 355 because that was code for lady. Near the end of 1779, several members were captured, including perhaps 355. There's a novella by Marie Benedict that suggests that she and her infant son were put on a ship where she died. Some sources suggest that the British never put women on the ship, so that's still a mystery. We know only that there was a female spy in the Culper Spring. 355 was her coded identity, and she was described as one who has been ever serviceable to this correspondence by Samuel Culper, the head of the ring. Anna Strong, I like this spy thing. Anna Spy has been identified as a member of the ring. She lived on Long Island near Culper, who used the alias Abraham Woodhull. She assisted in various ways, most famously using her clothesline to send messages. A certain petticoat was hung along with a certain number of handkerchiefs, and that signaled that there was a message for pickup, and the number of handkerchiefs told where to pick it up. Some historians argue that Anna was Agent 355, and the British never caught on to this gig. There were many other women who provided help and information to the colonial army. Emily Geiger, a young Patriot messenger, was captured by loyalists. She swallowed a message she was carrying from General Nathaniel Greene, remember his wife was mentioned earlier, to another American officer to prevent his discovery. While they were waiting for a woman to come and search her, they still had some courtesies. She swallowed the message. She then wrote on and delivered the message orally. This is another of our most famous young ladies who did extraordinary things. Relatives of Sybil Luddington were told this story. She was 16 and the daughter of Patriot Colonel Henry Luddington when she allegedly rode 40 miles at night to Danbury, Connecticut to alert the Army to a planned attack. That was 64 kilometers, and I can't tell you right now how much that is, 40 miles, to rouse American militiamen to attack the British forces near Danbury, Connecticut. According to the legend, she rode along the border after the British forces raided and burned Danbury, rallying the combatants for the Battle of Ridgefield the following day. There's this statue. We don't have the statue now. We had this version of the statue. There's a big bronze statue of her in Carmel, New York, on the horse. And there's a stamp. We got a picture of the stamp of her from 1776. At least one children's book, probably more. So although she's perhaps the most well-known of the young female horseback messengers, Since 1956, historians have argued that this story may not be true. You can read more about this dispute on Wikipedia, but remember that itself is not a standard source.
Other people's
And I
opinions.
need to take a short break. I'll try to respond to one or two questions. I have to get a drink.
There are some more chairs here if you want to pick them up and take over there, if you would like. Okay, oh, and there's a couple of chairs here. Just don't touch
Any
anything.
questions?
I won't
So
touch
far?
anything.
Okay.
20 minutes so far.
Am I going too fast?
Nope.
And it's loud enough.
Very interesting.
And just one other thing, folks in the back aren't sure they can hear you. We hadn't expected that, so that if you could raise the volume a little bit.
I'll try. I got up this morning with a frog in my throat, and I can't quite get rid of it. I'll tell you now that the books on the table over here are some of the ones that I use the most in preparing this talk. And I typed up a bibliography. It's probably not enough for everybody, but we can run more off, and Donna can put it online, or she could email them to you. Some of them are yellow, then I ran out of yellow paper, so then the rest are white. It's the same information.
Maybe you could just turn a little bit and they would hear better.
Try that.
And let us know if we can hear, okay? When
All right, let's see. Many women supported the war effort, especially in later years, by fundraising, as the Army was perpetually short of funds. Esther Reed, the young English-born wife of Joseph Reed, military secretary to Washington, authored a paper, The Sentiments of an American Woman, published in June 1780, near the end of the war, which exhorted women to sacrifice some luxuries for the armies which defend our lives, our possessions, our liberty. Remember, Esther was a fairly recent immigrant. He had been in England, they met, fell in love. Her parents wouldn't allow her to marry, so they were sort of engaged across the ocean for 5 years before she got over here. She devoted much of her time organizing support for the war. Her Philadelphia Ladies Association went door to door collecting donations. She reported to Washington that they had raised 634 paper dollars, which was a large sum even of the devalued paper. The ladies thought that the money should be changed into hard dollars and each soldier being given 2 for their own use as an offering of the ladies. Washington worried that the soldiers might waste the money and strongly suggested that the money be used to buy shirts. And they purchased 2,200 shirts. So it was a lot of money. Sadly, Esther died of dysentery just shy of her 34th birthday, later in 1780. Mary Diggs Lee, and she was the wife of the new governor of Maryland, learned that funds were so low that the Army might simply disband. So she organized a fundraising drive there that raised a considerable sum. And Washington suggested that shirts and black socks be obtained for the troops in the Southern Army. He was very firm and consistent in his suggestions. And this fundraising movement spread into other states. American Indians or I should probably say indigenous people, or whatever, were involved in the fight on both sides. Polly Cooper's story comes from the oral history of the Oneidas. The Army had endured a very long and tough winter at Valley Forge. They lacked food, proper clothing, and were suffering from disease. The Oneidas decided to help, and the whole tribe participated. A group, including Polly, traveled hundreds of miles to Pennsylvania, bringing as many as 600 baskets of corn, and staying to show them how to cook the white corn for human consumption, as it was different from the normal yellow, and it would have made them sick if they didn't cook it properly. According to oral tradition, she wouldn't accept any payment, and they gave her a black shawl. In some versions, the shawl was purchased, and others it was given to Polly by Martha Washington. And the Oneidas still keep that shawl as a treasured possession. And there's a statue of Polly in the American Indian Museum. In the Smithsonian, you can see George Washington on the left and one of her fellow tribespeople on the right. Joseph and Molly Brant were siblings and members of the Mohawk tribe here in New York who sided with England. He was a war chief and responsible for the Battle of Minisink here in Sullivan County, near present-day Narrowsburg, in July 1779. He continued to lead a band of Tories and Indians on raiding parties around the area and lost a battle against Major General John Sullivan, who gave his name to our county a few weeks later. Older sister Molly, also known as Mary, was the consort, or perhaps the wife, of Sir William Johnson, the British superintendent of Indian Affairs, with whom she had 8 children. During the war, she actively engaged in politics and had considerable influence. She was very loyal to the British, worked to persuade the Iroquois Confederacy to align with them, and played a crucial role in informing British forces of impending attacks. After he died in 1774, she left their home in Johnstown and returned to her native Canajoharie, further west on the Mohawk River, with her children, personal belongings, and slaves. She lived in a large, comfortable house and prospered as a fur trader. She spoke English well, was a devoted Anglican, could read and write, but always dressed in traditional Mohawk attire. After the war, she settled in Ontario, Canada, and she received a pension from the British for her services and was compensated for her financial losses. She has been criticized for her failure to have her indigenous people better treated in the post-war treaties. A portrait of her 3 faces was used for a Canadian postage stamp in 1986. Can't quite see that. We can see 2 of the 3 faces in this slide here. The center one being Indian, I think one being Johnson's wife, and one being her in her later life. Fundraising, spying, and carrying messages were very worthy activities, but some women did even more. They were on the battlefields, carrying water for drinking, but it was also needed to swab the cannons and performing other duties. Margaret Corbin, who was one of George Washington's deplorable camp followers, was on the battlefield with her husband, who was firing a cannon. She was also a nurse, so that's another reason why she was allowed there. This was in the battlefield defending Fort Washington, northern Manhattan. When he fell, she took over the firing. She was also wounded and disabled for life. She was awarded half pay, and a clothing allowance, and a person from Congress a pension from Congress for military service. A DAR request to rebury her at West Point was granted, the only female Revolutionary veteran so honored. There is also the historical marker about her service in nearby Highland Falls, and a memorial for her and compatriots, Fort Tryon Park, near the battle location in northern Manhattan. The DAR presents an annual Margaret Cochran Corbin Award to a woman in military service. And next is our famous woman, Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher is not a real person, in case you didn't know that. But it's a generic name given to the women who carried the necessary water on the battlefields. The troops would shout, "Mayor, Molly, Pitcher," whenever they needed fresh water. Some claim she was first used for Mary Ludwig Hayes or for Mary Corbin. We just talked about Mary Corbin. Mary Hayes was present at Monmouth. Her husband was an artilleryman in that battle, and she had spent the winter of 1777 with her husband at Valley Forge, so he had watched the men train. She was also a member of Martha Washington's group that helped care for the sick, did sewing and laundry. At Monmouth, when William fell, she took over, firing her husband's cannon. At one point, a British musket or cannonball flew between her legs, tearing off the bottom of her skirt. She reportedly said, "Well, that could have been worse," and went back to loading the cannon. Washington gave her the nickname Sergeant Molly, and she used that for the rest of her life. In 1822, she was granted a pension of $40, equivalent to $968 last year, by Pennsylvania for her services in the Revolutionary War. She's buried in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where there's a statue of her alongside a cannon. Deborah Sampson is the most famous of the women who fought as men. She grew up poor in Massachusetts. I think she was actually maybe an indentured servant. She sewed a suit of clothes secretly, changed in the woods, enlisted in the army as Robert Shirtliff. She served 3 years and was wounded at least twice. Tall, strong, and beardless, her fellow soldiers called her Molly, but never suspected her real identity. Finally, she contracted a fever, nearly dying, and the doctor discovered her secret. He quietly kept her at his home until she was well, then sent her with a letter to George Washington. Reportedly, he silently read the letter, handed her a discharge, and some money to get to a home. Years later, he invited her to Congress, which voted her a pension and some land. After her death, her husband petitioned Congress for a service benefit, which he received. So these people did serious things, and they got some recognition for them, sometimes years later. Sarah Osborne is our next one. She marched with her husband from Philadelphia to Baltimore to Yorktown. It's a long walk. Cooking for him and a few others, and baking for the army. In Yorktown, she cooked and carried beef, bread, and coffee in a gallon pot to soldiers in the entrenchment. On one such occasion, she met Washington, who said, "Are you not afraid of cannonballs?" She replied that it wouldn't do for the men to fight and starve too. This testimony was part of her deposition to Congress, written to obtain a veteran survivor's benefit after the war. Okay, our next lady is a New Yorker. Catherine Schuyler braved the threat of Indian attacks to travel to the family's estate. It's almost 35 miles from Albany to what is present-day Schuylerville, to get some papers and burn the wheat fields to prevent Burgoyne's army from harvesting it. So, this is present-day Schuylerville. At the time, it was part of Saratoga. Just across the Hudson from my hometown, this was just before the Battle of Saratoga, so Burgoyne was on the way. And as you know, Saratoga, they're burning the wheat. Saratoga is known as the turning point of the war. The British burned the house, but didn't get any wheat. General Philip Schuyler reportedly had the house rebuilt in just 29 days using many salvaged materials. And this is, when I was growing up, it was shabby with fading like paint. This is now part of the National Trust, so it's being well maintained. And our next one is, you may or may not know anything about. That's the Schuyler Mansion in Albany. You can visit there. The Schuylers had a lot of money. They were very wealthy in land, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a few minutes. And that's the monument in Saratoga, and it has 4 niches. And this is the boot. Does anybody know why the boot's there? Has nobody's name on it. It's just there. Well, this always interested me when I was a kid. There are 4 niches, and there's a statue of Philip Schuyler, Nathaniel Green, I don't think I wrote it down, but now I don't remember. There was one there for Benedict Arnold, because he was a hero, and he was, his leg was so damaged during the battle that he was permanently disabled and walked with a limp for the rest of his life. And so, because of what he did later, They wouldn't put a statue up, but because he had been a hero there, they put his boot. But there is no name on the monument, just the boot. But I want to talk now about Eliza Lucas Pinckney. She was just 16 years old when her father left her to manage all his property in South Carolina, which was a lot, including the slaves, to return to military duty in the West Indies. She was in the British Army. She excelled. She studied agricultural methods for rice, was the first to grow indigo commercially, and tested other crops, including silk, for successful production in South Carolina. And this is a piece of cotton dyed with indigo in South Carolina at the plantation, which is next to where hers used to be. And we were there in late January, so I brought this so I'd have it to show you. Okay. And of course, you know it was majorly used for the French and the British for uniforms, and of course now it's used for our beloved Levi's. And nobody had ever really grown it commercially before her. She married Charles Pinckney, a much older widower, and her neighbor when she was 22. They had 3 children, Charles Coatsworth, Thomas, and daughter Harriet, who were all active in the war effort and later served in the new government. He's called Charles Coatsworth because there were so many Charles. And one of the strange things that we're looking at history is they use the same names. Not just like Junior or the third or something like we might do here, but like in the same family. And occasionally people had a son or a daughter who died, and then they might name a later one with the same name, which I can't really understand, but anyway, it does make solving these puzzles quite challenging. Eliza's success as a farmer became useless when the British burned all her holdings, stored her jewelry, and all her other possessions, including her slaves, which they sold, and left her a destitute widow. And they finally succeeded in capturing her beloved Charlestown, now Charleston, which they devastated, including the homes that she and her sons owned in Charleston. The many accomplishments of Eliza influenced the course of U.S. history and agriculture, methods especially in the South. When she died in 1793, President Washington served as a pallbearer at her funeral by his own request. And I have a book that I purchased when I was down there that was written and illustrated by a very talented artist. I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing yet, but it's really lovely to look at. Last and certainly not least, I'd like to introduce you to 2 women who both grew up in privileged families but had vastly different experiences during the Revolution and later. And we'll start with the traitor. Peggy Shippen was raised as a Philadelphia Quaker family, one of 3 beautiful daughters. She was a fun-loving belle, courted by John Andre, who was a British officer during the British occupation of Philadelphia. And the portrait on the left was done by Andre when he was courting her. Recruited as a spy for England, she set her sights on General Benedict Arnold, a widower with 3 sons. He had served valiantly in Quebec, at Ticonderoga, and Saratoga. He was bitter about his injury. His current position in Philadelphia had been passed over for promotion and even court-martialed while in command of Philadelphia. So he was ripe for her machinations. Peggy married him and was instrumental in his treason from the beginning. He engineered an appointment to serve at West Point and plotted to turn this most important asset over to the British for 20,000 pounds sterling. Fortunately, the plot was discovered when John Andre was captured. Arnold received the news and managed to escape to a British ship. Peggy was left with their infant son to serve breakfast to George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and the Marquis de Lafayette at their home across the river from West Point. When told of the plot, she feigned ignorance and madness and tried to convince them of her ignorance. She was partially successful because she really evidently was a very good actress. She returned to John Andre was hung. Peggy returned to her parents' home in Philadelphia until the end of the war, and Arnold donned a British uniform and fought in some of our battles in the South. They later lived in England and were never satisfied with their political and social standing, although Peggy later received a 500-pound pension for very meritorious services. Eliza Schuyler Hamilton was also one of 3 daughters. It's become very famous from the current Broadway play. The second of General Schuyler's 3 oldest children. Both parents were Hudson Valley Dutch royalty and quite wealthy. In 1777, the general invited Washington's aide, Alexander Hamilton, to visit their mansion in Albany. Later, in February 1780, that is 3 years later, Eliza was visiting an aunt in Morristown, where the army was at winter quarters. They met again, fell in love, and married later that year. It was a love match, but very advantageous to Hamilton. He received the benefit of Eliza's devotion and good sense, as well as her dowry. And as they had financial problems on and off during her life, her father, who lived to a quite old age, kept sending food and things down the Hudson River to them in Manhattan. Even though he was handsome and brilliant, without her unwavering support and muse, he could never have risen so high. He'd had command at Yorktown, and later, as you know, rose to prominence in the national government as Secretary of the Treasury. In 1783, the British finally left New York. I hadn't really registered that the war, they surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, but they were still all over our country until 1783 and maybe more. But they finally left New York City, and the couple set up housekeeping on Wall Street, and Hamilton his law office in town. Eliza supported her husband in all things, his many, many political meetings, including future presidents Madison and Monroe, his writing, including many of the Federalist Papers, and much more. After his murder in a duel by rival Aaron Burr, she lived 50 years. She spent many of them raising their 7 living children, collecting and organizing his papers, and doing charity work, and being a co-founder and supporter of a mission in the city for orphan children and helping wives in distress. This still exists today as the Graham Windham and provides comprehensive family support. Later, she lived with family in Washington, D.C., where she helped raise funds for the Washington Monument. She personally knew her first 5 presidents, our first 5 presidents, and was the oldest Revolutionary War widow when she died at age 97 in 1854. As the war raged on, even after the surrender at Yorktown, our amazing founding mothers were still in charge at home, often in danger as hostilities may have been on their doorsteps, or they served beside their men at camp. These are just a few of the ordinary women who did extraordinary things in support of American independence. Many of their names are known, but many more remain unknown. The war was fought very close to their homes and other property. Cities were occupied, British forces were lodged in their homes, they endured long absences from loved ones, suffered loss of homes and property, constant fear from and harassment by British forces, and loss of life for freedom. British Lord General Cornwallis once lamented, "We may destroy all the men in America, and we shall still have all we can do to defeat the women." I mentioned before I have an annotated list of sources if you'd like to learn more about these amazing women. I still prefer books, although there are many reliable internet sites. It was where Donna retrieved the photos for the PowerPoint, and I did use it some for fact-checking. Thank you, Donna. I saw many new or expanded websites, even some devoted to women, especially as we celebrate this 250th anniversary. Of course, there's Hamilton the Music on Broadway, and you may know that it's also on Disney. I recommend it. I was fortunate enough to see it about the 3rd or 4th year it was on Broadway. And Ken Burns has a new 14-hour series, The American Revolution, now on PBS, and there's a very extensive website devoted to that with pictures and other commentary, which just came up.